Sunday mornings in Los Angeles had a certain rhythm for Sarah and her 8-year-old daughter, Emily. Living in a modest, sunlit apartment nestled in a quiet neighborhood, their routine began early. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as Sarah moved briskly around their small but cozy kitchen. The sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. "Mom, I can't find my blue dress," Emily called from her room, her voice laced with urgency. Sarah placed her mug on the counter and smiled. "Check the laundry basket, sweetheart. It might still be there." Emily appeared moments later, a bundle of energy with her curly auburn hair bouncing as she moved. She was clutching her favorite blue dress, slightly wrinkled but still her top choice. Sarah helped her daughter slip into it, noticing how Emily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Are you ready for church?" Sarah asked, smoothing the fabric over Emily's shoulders. Emily nodded eagerly. "I can't wait to see Pastor Mark. He said he has a surprise for us today." Sarah's smile faltered just a bit, though she quickly masked it. Emily adored the church's children's program, and Pastor Mark was a central figure in making it so enjoyable. He had a natural gift with kids, often leading them in creative activities and games. Yet, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of protectiveness every time Emily mentioned him. The two of them gathered their things, a Bible for Sarah, a small notebook and crayons for Emily, and stepped outside. The streets were quiet, the usual LA bustle muted in the early morning hours. They walked to their car, an old but reliable sedan, and began the short drive to their local church. As they neared the building, Emily's excitement grew. "Do you think Pastor Mark will do another magic trick today?" she asked, practically bouncing in her seat. Sarah laughed softly. "Maybe. He always seems to have something fun planned." The church was a small but vibrant community hub, with brick walls covered in ivy and a neatly maintained garden out front. They parked and made their way inside, greeted by warm smiles and familiar faces. Emily, as always, raced ahead toward the children's area, leaving Sarah to follow at a more leisurely pace. "Good morning, Sarah," a cheerful voice called out. It was Mrs. Jenkins, a longtime member of the congregation. "Good morning," Sarah replied, adjusting her purse on her shoulder. "Emily's already off to find Pastor Mark." Mrs. Jenkins chuckled. "That man sure has a way with the kids. They can't get enough of him." Sarah forced a polite smile, though her earlier hesitation resurfaced. She nodded and excused herself, heading into the sanctuary for the service. The church's interior was simple yet welcoming, with rows of wooden pews and large stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Bible. As the congregation settled in, the choir began to sing a hymn, their voices filling the space with a sense of peace. Sarah glanced toward the children's area, where Emily was now animatedly chatting with Pastor Mark. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a warm, engaging demeanor. His reputation as a kind and dedicated leader was well established, and most of the parents trusted him implicitly. Still, Sarah couldn't shake a faint unease as she watched him crouch down to speak with her daughter, his gestures animated and friendly. The service began, and Sarah tried to focus on the sermon, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Emily and the time she would soon spend in the private children's room. She told herself it was probably nothing, just a mother's instinct to be cautious in an unpredictable world. Yet, the feeling persisted, lingering like a shadow in the back of her mind. By the time the sermon ended, Sarah resolved to stay vigilant. For now, she would let Emily enjoy the morning, but if anything seemed even slightly out of place, she would be ready to act. As Sarah stepped out of the sanctuary, the murmur of voices and the sound of children's laughter echoed down the hallway. She made her way toward the children's area, where Emily had disappeared earlier. The brightly colored room was alive with activity, paper crafts, building blocks, and a small group of kids practicing a song for next week's service. In the center of it all was Pastor Mark. "Emily," Sarah called gently, her eyes scanning the room. Emily turned, her face lighting up as she ran toward her mother. "Mom, Pastor Mark just told us about a scavenger hunt we're doing today." Pastor Mark followed behind Emily, a broad smile on his face. His demeanor was calm and reassuring, the kind of presence that immediately put people at ease. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, his sleeves rolled up as if ready to jump into the children's games himself. "Good morning, Sarah," he greeted warmly, extending a hand. "Emily was just telling me how much she loves Sundays here." Sarah shook his hand, nodding politely. "Good morning, Pastor Mark." "Yes, she's been looking forward to it all week. She's a joy to have in our group," Pastor Mark replied. His voice was measured, almost soothing. "We're doing something a little special today, a treasure hunt with a lesson tied to the parable of the lost coin." The kids seemed pretty excited. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Can I go, Mom?" "Please," Sarah hesitated, glancing around the room. The other parents were mingling nearby, chatting and sipping coffee while their children played. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, yet that faint unease lingered. She forced herself to smile. "Of course, sweetheart," she said. "Just stay with the group, okay?" "I will," Emily promised, running back to join the other kids. Pastor Mark lingered for a moment, observing the children. "We keep it fun but meaningful," he said, as if sensing Sarah's hesitation. "Teaching through play helps them understand lessons they might not grasp otherwise." Sarah nodded but didn't say much. Something about his words felt rehearsed, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Feel free to check in whenever you like," Pastor Mark added, as if reading her mind. "We always welcome parents to see what's going on." "Thanks," Sarah replied. "I might do that." As Pastor Mark returned to the children, Sarah found herself lingering near the door. She watched as he knelt to their level, explaining the rules of the treasure hunt with enthusiasm. The kids hung on his every word, their giggles filling the room. Emily looked over her shoulder and waved, her face glowing with excitement. "Everything okay, Sarah?" It was Mrs. Jenkins again, standing beside her with a curious expression. "Yes, just keeping an eye on Emily," Sarah replied, forcing a casual tone. Mrs. Jenkins smiled knowingly. "Mark is wonderful with them. He's been organizing these activities for years. My grandson adores him." "I'm sure he is," Sarah said, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. As she returned to the sanctuary for the rest of the service, Sarah couldn't help but glance back one more time. Pastor Mark was now leading the children out of the room, presumably toward the scavenger hunt location. Emily was at the front of the line, holding a brightly colored map. The church service resumed with its usual rhythm: songs of worship, scripture readings, and the pastor's sermon. Sarah sat in her usual spot, the third pew from the front, but her attention wavered. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the children's area and the scavenger hunt that Emily and the others had been so eager about. She tried to reassure herself, reasoning that everything seemed perfectly fine. Pastor Mark had a stellar reputation in the community, and other parents spoke highly of him. Yet, a faint unease gnawed at the edges of her mind. It wasn't any one thing, just a subtle discomfort she couldn't explain. Her train of thought was interrupted by the pastor's voice echoing through the sanctuary. "And just as the shepherd rejoiced when he found his lost sheep," he said, "so too does our Father rejoice when one of his children returns to him." Sarah glanced around at the congregation. Most were nodding along, immersed in the message. She shifted in her seat, glancing toward the back doors of the sanctuary, which led to the children's area. The faint sound of laughter floated in, followed by a louder voice, Pastor Mark's unmistakable tone. Sarah furrowed her brow. The children's activities were usually kept quiet during the service to avoid distractions. Today, however, the noise seemed different, more frequent, more noticeable. "Maybe I'm just imagining it," she whispered to herself, but the unsettled feeling didn't fade. As soon as the sermon ended and the choir began the closing hymn, Sarah slipped out of the pew. She made her way down the corridor toward the children's area. The hallway was quiet except for the muffled sounds of children's voices. When she reached the activity room, she paused at the door. It was open, but the room was empty. Her heartbeat quickened as she moved farther down the hallway. The laughter was louder now, coming from a room at the end of the corridor, a room she hadn't noticed before. The door was ajar, and Sarah could see the edge of a brightly colored poster taped to the wall inside. Carefully, she approached and peeked in. Pastor Mark was there, surrounded by the children. He was holding up a small treasure chest and explaining something Sarah couldn't quite hear. The kids were enthralled, their faces lit up with joy and curiosity. Still, Sarah's attention was drawn to the way Pastor Mark positioned himself, always standing between the door and the children, as if shielding the room from prying eyes. The setup of the room was also different from the main activity area. It felt more enclosed, more private. "Hey, Sarah," came a voice from behind her. She jumped, startled, and turned to see Mrs. Jenkins. "Oh, hi," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Are you looking for Emily?" Mrs. Jenkins asked. "They're in there. Mark's probably wrapping up the treasure hunt." "Yes, just checking in," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. Mrs. Jenkins peeked through the door as well. "He's so good with them, isn't he? My grandson loves these activities. Always comes home with a story to tell." Sarah nodded but didn't reply. Something about the setup still didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't articulate why. As Mrs. Jenkins walked away, Sarah lingered for a moment longer. Then she noticed something peculiar. The door to the room was equipped with a lock. She glanced around, wondering why a children's activity room would need a locking mechanism. It wasn't locked now, but the mere presence of it sent her mind racing. She stepped back, determined to give Emily the benefit of the doubt, but also resolved to pay closer attention. The rest of the day unfolded smoothly, with Emily returning to her mother after the activities, beaming and chattering about the treasure hunt. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as they drove home. That night, as she tucked Emily into bed, she decided to ask a gentle question. "Did you have fun today, sweetheart?" she began, sitting on the edge of Emily's bed. "Yes. Pastor Mark said I was the best at finding clues," Emily replied proudly. Sarah smiled. "That's great. What kind of clues did you find?" Emily thought for a moment. "There were little papers with Bible verses on them. And then at the end, we got to open a treasure chest. It had candy in it." "Sounds fun," Sarah said, her tone light. But deep inside, her unease grew. She kissed Emily on the forehead and whispered goodnight, resolving to trust her instincts and keep her eyes open. The following Sunday began much like the last, with Sarah and Emily heading to church, the morning sun warming their drive. Emily, as always, was buzzing with excitement about seeing her friends and joining Pastor Mark's activities. Sarah, however, carried her unease from the previous week like a shadow that refused to dissipate. After dropping Emily off at the children's area, Sarah lingered for a moment, her eyes following her daughter as she eagerly joined the group. Pastor Mark was already there, crouched at the center of the children, speaking to them with his usual animated gestures. "Emily, you're just in time," Pastor Mark said warmly, his voice carrying through the room. Emily beamed and ran toward him. Sarah watched from a distance, her lips pressed into a thin line. She reminded herself to stay calm, to observe. Perhaps this week would confirm that her worries were unfounded. After the service began, Sarah remained in the sanctuary, listening to the opening hymn, though her focus drifted. She couldn't ignore the feeling in her chest, a gnawing mix of anxiety and protectiveness. About 30 minutes into the sermon, Sarah noticed something odd. Pastor Mark reappeared in the hallway, quietly leading a small group of children, Emily among them. They were heading toward the room at the end of the corridor, the same room Sarah had noticed last week. The door clicked shut behind them. A spike of unease shot through Sarah. She leaned over to whisper to Mrs. Jenkins, who was sitting beside her. "Do you know what they do in that back room?" Sarah asked, keeping her tone casual. "Oh, just special lessons, I think," Mrs. Jenkins replied without much thought. "Mark says it's a quiet space where they can focus on Bible stories." Sarah nodded, though the explanation did little to quell her unease. She excused herself and slipped out of the sanctuary, her steps measured but determined. As she approached the hallway, the sounds of the service faded behind her. The corridor was empty, and the faint sound of children's laughter came from behind the closed door. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what she was expecting to find, but her instincts urged her forward. The door to the private room was locked. She tried the handle twice to be sure, her pulse quickening. Leaning closer, she pressed her ear to the door. She could hear Pastor Mark's voice, calm and steady, but couldn't make out the words. The children's voices followed, punctuated by bursts of laughter. Sarah stepped back, her thoughts racing. Why would the door need to be locked during a children's activity? She glanced around, the hallway still empty, and debated her next move. Confronting Pastor Mark directly felt too drastic. She had no evidence of anything wrong, just a lingering sense that something wasn't right. Her train of thought was interrupted when the door suddenly opened. Sarah stepped back quickly, heart pounding. Pastor Mark stood in the doorway, his expression momentarily surprised before it melted into a smile. "Sarah," he said warmly. "Looking for Emily?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the thrum of nerves beneath it. "I just wanted to see how things were going." Pastor Mark stepped aside slightly, gesturing toward the room. Inside, the children were seated in a circle on the floor, laughing and chatting. A Bible was open on a small table in the center, surrounded by crayons and paper. "We're just wrapping up a little lesson," he explained. "Emily's doing great, as always." Sarah forced a smile, though her eyes scanned the room quickly. Everything appeared perfectly normal, perhaps even mundane. But the lock on the door and the brief look of surprise on Pastor Mark's face lingered in her mind. "Well, I'll let you get back to it," she said, stepping back. "Thanks for letting me check in." "Of course," Pastor Mark replied, his smile unwavering. "You're always welcome to stop by." As Sarah walked away, her thoughts churned. Maybe she was being overly cautious, or maybe her instincts were trying to tell her something important. Either way, she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't ignore her intuition. That evening, as Sarah sat at the dining table sipping a cup of tea, her mind replayed the events of the day. She tried to shake off the unease she felt about the locked door, but the more she thought about it, the more questions surfaced. Why had Pastor Mark locked the room during a children's activity? Why had he seemed surprised to see her outside the door? Was she overreacting? Or was there something deeper she couldn't yet see? Emily was in her room, humming a tune as she colored in a sketchbook. Her innocence and joy were Sarah's greatest treasures, and the thought of anything or anyone jeopardizing that made her heart tighten. The tea grew cold as Sarah sat in silence, staring at the steam as it faded into the air. Finally, she sighed and picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Rachel, another mother at the church who had a daughter in the same age group as Emily. The phone rang twice before Rachel answered. "Hi, Sarah. How are you?" "Hi, Rachel. I'm fine," Sarah said, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to ask, does your daughter ever mention the activities they do with Pastor Mark in the private room?" Rachel hesitated. "Not really, no. Emma just says she has fun and they play games." "Why do you ask?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Something about it seems odd. The room is locked, and I just thought it was strange." Rachel chuckled nervously. "I've never really thought about it, to be honest. Mark's always been great with the kids." "I know," Sarah said quickly. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I guess I'm just being a cautious mom." "I get it," Rachel said. "Let me know if you find out anything. I'd hate to think there's something we're not aware of." After hanging up, Sarah decided to do a bit of digging on her own. She opened her laptop and searched for Pastor Mark's name, along with the name of the church. The results were exactly what she expected: glowing reviews, community events, and testimonies about his positive impact on the congregation. Yet, the more Sarah read, the more she felt like something was missing. There was almost no personal information about him, no details about his background, no interviews or personal anecdotes. The next day, Sarah called the church office. She disguised her inquiry as a casual conversation, asking about Pastor Mark's tenure and his role within the children's ministry. "Oh, Pastor Mark has been with us for about 5 years," the receptionist said cheerfully. "He's been such a blessing to the church, especially with the kids." "That's wonderful," Sarah replied, her tone light. "Do you know where he worked before coming here?" The receptionist paused. I'm not sure. I think he mentioned working in youth programs at another church, but I don't know the details. Is there something specific you're looking for?" "No, just curious," Sarah said quickly. "Thank you for your time." As she hung up, her unease deepened. She realized how little she, or anyone, for that matter, knew about Pastor Mark's past. Deciding that she needed more clarity, she made a plan. Next Sunday, she would position herself closer to the children's area and try to observe more closely. If her instincts were wrong, she would find relief in that. But if there was anything suspicious, she needed to know for Emily's sake. and for the sake of the other children. That week, Sarah kept her concerns to herself, though the tension simmered beneath the surface. She spoke to a few other parents in passing, subtly steering the conversation toward Pastor Mark and his activities. Most of them expressed nothing but trust and admiration for him, which only made Sarah feel more isolated in her suspicions. By the time Sunday arrived, Sarah had steeled herself. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she knew she couldn't let her doubts fester any longer. As she and Emily walked into the church that morning, Sarah glanced down at her daughter, who was chattering happily about her week at school. "Emily," Sarah said softly, kneeling to her level, "if anything ever feels strange or uncomfortable during church activities, you can always tell me, okay? No matter what." Emily blinked, slightly confused but nodding earnestly. "Okay, Mom." Sarah kissed her forehead and stood, her resolve firm. She would trust her instincts, even if it meant confronting the uncomfortable truth. As Sarah stepped into the church that Sunday, she carried an unshakable resolve. She had spent the past week thinking about the locked door, the subtle shifts in Pastor Mark's demeanor, and the unwavering trust of the other parents. Today, she wasn't going to let her doubts go unanswered. Emily, as usual, darted off toward the children's area, her energy palpable. Sarah lingered in the lobby, her eyes scanning the room. A small group of parents were chatting by the coffee station, their laughter and casual conversation blending with the hum of activity around the church. Sarah recognized two mothers from the congregation, Rachel, whom she'd spoken with on the phone, and a newer member, Lisa, whose young son had recently joined the children's group. Summoning her courage, Sarah approached them with a smile. "Morning, ladies." "Sarah, good morning," Rachel greeted, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "How's Emily?" "She's good," Sarah replied. "She practically ran here this morning. She's so excited about whatever Pastor Mark has planned." Lisa chuckled. "Oh, my son is the same. He's been talking about the games all week. It's amazing how much they adore him." "Yeah," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her mind churned. "What do your kids usually say about the activities in the private room?" Rachel raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I guess I've just been wondering what they do in there," Sarah said, keeping her tone light. "Emily loves it, but she doesn't talk much about what actually happens. Do your kids?" Lisa tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, Tommy said they read Bible stories and play some games. He mentioned something about a treasure chest last week." Rachel nodded. "Emma talks about it a bit. She says they do crafts and sometimes get little prizes." "Interesting," Sarah said. "Has anyone ever actually been in the room with them?" The question hung in the air for a moment, the cheerful chatter around them fading into the background. "I don't think so," Rachel said slowly. "Mark's always been very insistent on the kids having their own space during those sessions. He says it helps them focus." "That makes sense," Lisa added. "I mean, he's been doing this for years. I doubt there's anything to worry about." Sarah hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Did you know the door to that room locks?" Rachel and Lisa exchanged glances. "Locks?" Rachel echoed. "Why would it need to lock?" "I don't know," Sarah said carefully. "That's what's been bothering me. I'm sure it's nothing, but it's strange, right?" Lisa frowned, shifting her weight. "I never noticed. Do you think we should ask about it?" "I'm not sure," Sarah admitted. "I just feel like we should know more. We trust him with our kids, after all." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter spilling into the hallway. Pastor Mark was leading the group toward the private room, his voice warm and inviting as he explained the day's activity. Emily and Tommy were at the front of the line, giggling about something only they understood. Sarah watched as they disappeared into the room, the door closing softly behind them. She felt a pang in her chest, her instinct screaming for her to act, though she wasn't sure how. "Maybe we should talk to the church board," Rachel suggested after a moment. "Just to clarify things." Lisa nodded. "It's probably a good idea. Not to accuse anyone, but for peace of mind." Sarah agreed, though her resolve to investigate on her own hadn't waned. She decided to observe discreetly that day, hoping to gather enough information to either quell her fears or confirm them. The week that followed was marked by an uneasy tension for Sarah. Each time she replayed the events of Sunday in her mind, her concerns grew sharper, not duller. She tried to focus on work and the mundane rhythm of life, but her thoughts kept circling back to the locked door, Pastor Mark, and the private activities in the children's room. Her instincts screamed at her to dig deeper, yet she questioned whether she was overthinking. One evening, after tucking Emily into bed, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. She opened her browser and hesitated before typing. What was she even searching for? Locked doors in children's ministry? Signs of something suspicious? Every query seemed paranoid, even to her. Still, she began reading articles and discussion forums about church safety protocols and children's ministry practices. One thread caught her attention. A mother in another state described her experience with a children's pastor who had gained immense trust within their community, but later turned out to be hiding inappropriate behavior. The story was detailed and unsettling, striking a chord with Sarah. The mother had noticed small inconsistencies, subtle actions that seemed harmless at first but, in hindsight, were red flags. Sarah closed her laptop, her chest tight. Was she imagining things, or was her concern rooted in something real? She needed clarity but didn't know how to get it without alarming others, or herself. The following day, Sarah decided to speak with Emily about the activities in the private room. She approached the conversation carefully, not wanting to influence her daughter's answers. "Emily," Sarah said as they sat at the kitchen counter, "what do you like most about the children's activities at church?" Emily's eyes lit up. "The games. And Pastor Mark always has cool prizes. What kind of games?" Sarah asked casually, stirring her tea. "Well," Emily began, swinging her legs beneath the stool, "last week we did a treasure hunt. And we also colored pictures of Bible stories. It's really fun." Sarah smiled, though her stomach churned. "Do you always do those activities in the private room?" "Mostly," Emily said, nodding. "Pastor Mark says it's our special place where we can focus and not get distracted." Sarah hesitated before asking, "Does he ever tell you not to talk about what happens in there?" Emily frowned, her expression puzzled. "No, but he says it's more fun if it's a surprise for everyone else." Sarah forced a laugh, ruffling her daughter's hair. "That does sound fun. I'm glad you enjoy it." As Emily skipped away to play, Sarah sat back, her mind racing. Nothing Emily said sounded alarming, yet the secrecy still didn't sit well with her. She decided to bring her concerns to someone who might have insight, a friend who worked in child development and had experience with church programs. 2 days later, Sarah met her friend, Angela, for coffee. Angela was a sharp, no-nonsense type with a warm heart and a knack for getting to the bottom of things. After catching up on small talk, Sarah broached the subject. "Angela, can I ask your opinion on something?" "Of course," Angela said, setting her cup down. "What's on your mind?" Sarah recounted everything. The locked door, the private room, the secrecy around the activities. Angela listened intently, her brow furrowing. "It could be nothing," Sarah concluded, "but I just can't shake the feeling that something's off." Angela was quiet for a moment before responding. "You're right to trust your instincts, Sarah. Even if everything's fine, it's worth looking into. Have you spoken to anyone on the church board about this?" "Not yet," Sarah admitted. "I don't want to cause a scene if I'm wrong." "You don't have to," Angela said firmly, "but you should ask questions. Transparency is important, especially when it involves kids. If Pastor Mark is as trustworthy as everyone says, he won't mind you digging a little." Sarah nodded, feeling both reassured and unsettled. Angela was right. She couldn't let her fears paralyze her into inaction. She resolved to approach someone on the church board discreetly while continuing to observe the situation herself. As Sunday approached, Sarah felt a mixture of determination and apprehension. She wasn't sure what she would uncover, but she was prepared to take the next step, whatever it might be. The next Sunday arrived, and Sarah was ready to take action. After a week of reflection, quiet conversations with other parents, and some advice from Angela, she had resolved to confront Pastor Mark directly. If there was nothing to hide, he would understand her concerns as a mother. If there was something amiss, she would get to the bottom of it. Emily, as usual, was thrilled to go to church. Sarah helped her get dressed and packed her small bag with crayons and a notebook. On the way to church, Sarah gently broached the subject again. Emily, if you ever feel uncomfortable or confused about anything at church, you can always tell me, okay? She said. Mom, you've said that before, Emily replied, rolling her eyes but smiling. I know. I just want to make sure, Sarah said, squeezing her daughter's hand. It's important to me. When they arrived, Emily ran off to join the other children. Sarah lingered in the lobby, watching as Pastor Mark greeted the kids. She waited for a moment when he wasn't surrounded by children or parents and approached him. Pastor Mark, Sarah said, keeping her tone friendly but firm, do you have a moment to talk? Of course, Sarah, he said, his smile warm and inviting. What's on your mind? She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. I've noticed that the door to the private room is always locked during the children's activities. I'm sure there's a good reason for it, but as a parent, it's something I'd like to understand better. Pastor Mark's expression didn't falter, though there was a flicker of something, surprise, in his eyes. I completely understand, he said. The lock is there for safety. We've had incidents in the past where kids wandered out of rooms, and we want to make sure everyone stays safe and accounted for. That makes sense, Sarah said, though her tone remained cautious. But why not keep it unlocked when there's an adult supervising? It's part of our policy, Pastor Mark explained, his tone even. We've found that it helps maintain focus during the activities. But if it's something that concerns you, I'd be happy to discuss it further or even adjust how we handle things. Sarah wasn't fully convinced. Would it be possible for me to observe one of the sessions? She asked. Pastor Mark's smile tightened slightly. We usually discourage parents from joining because it changes the dynamic with the kids. They tend to act differently when parents are around, and it can take away from the experience. I understand that, Sarah said, but I'd feel more comfortable if I could see for myself. There was a long pause. Pastor Mark studied her for a moment before nodding. I can arrange that, he said finally. How about next week? I'll let you sit in on one of the sessions. Sarah nodded, her resolve firm. Thank you. I appreciate it. The rest of the service passed in a blur. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. While Pastor Mark's explanation seemed reasonable on the surface, she couldn't ignore the subtle tension in his demeanor. It was as if he was trying to appear unbothered while carefully controlling the narrative. After the service, she spoke briefly with Rachel and Lisa, sharing her conversation with Pastor Mark. Both women were surprised but supportive. Maybe we've been too trusting, Rachel admitted. It doesn't hurt to ask questions. Exactly, Sarah said. We owe it to our kids. That evening, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She was finally taking steps to address her concerns, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought might not come easily. The next week would be crucial, and she resolved to approach it with both an open mind and a cautious heart. The following Sunday, Sarah arrived at church with a mixture of nerves and determination. She had spoken with Pastor Mark during the week to confirm that she would be allowed to observe the children's session that day. Despite his reassurance that everything was above board, Sarah's mind still swirled with doubts. Emily, as always, was excited to join her friends. Mom, do I still get to do the activities if you're coming too? She asked, her brow furrowed. Of course, sweetheart, Sarah said, kneeling to smooth her daughter's hair. I just want to see all the fun things you're doing. Okay, Emily replied, her usual excitement returning. She ran off toward the children's area. Sarah followed shortly after, her stomach tightening as she approached the door to the private room. Pastor Mark stood outside, greeting parents and children as they arrived. When he saw Sarah, he gave her the same warm smile he always did. Sarah, glad you could join us, he said. I've set up a chair for you in the back, so you can observe comfortably. Thank you, Sarah replied, her voice steady but cautious. She stepped into the room, taking in her surroundings. The private room was brightly lit and filled with cheerful decorations, colorful posters with Bible verses, craft supplies neatly organized on shelves, and a large rug in the center where the children gathered. It was far from the sterile, foreboding space Sarah had imagined. The children were already settling in, their chatter filling the room. Emily waved to her mother from her spot on the rug, a grin on her face. Sarah gave a small wave back, her heart softening slightly at the sight of her daughter's happiness. Pastor Mark began the session with a short prayer, then explained the day's activity, a role-playing game based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. He assigned roles to each child, using props like scarves and toy coins to make the story more engaging. As the activity unfolded, Sarah observed closely. Pastor Mark's demeanor was exactly as it had always been, kind, patient, and encouraging. He crouched to the children's level as he spoke, his tone gentle and engaging. The kids were clearly having fun, their laughter echoing through the room as they acted out their parts. After the role play, the children gathered around a small table where Pastor Mark had set up a treasure chest. Inside were small trinkets and candies, which he handed out as rewards for participation. The kids cheered, excitedly examining their prizes. Sarah watched all of this with a growing sense of relief. Nothing about the session seemed inappropriate or secretive. The locked door, she realized, might have been an overcautious measure to keep the children safe in a busy building. When the session ended, Pastor Mark approached Sarah. "Well, what did you think?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. "It was great," Sarah admitted. "The kids were engaged, and the activities were meaningful." Pastor Mark smiled. "I'm glad you could see it for yourself. I understand your concerns. It's natural for parents to be protective. If you ever have questions, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Sarah said, feeling a wave of gratitude. "I appreciate you letting me be here today." As Sarah and Emily drove home that afternoon, Emily chattered excitedly about the role-playing game and the treasure chest. Sarah listened, her earlier fears now replaced with a sense of peace. That evening, as Sarah reflected on the day, she realized the experience had taught her an important lesson. While her intuition had been valuable in prompting her to investigate, it was equally important to approach situations with an open mind. In this case, her concerns had been unfounded, but the journey had strengthened her trust in her instincts and in the community around her. That night, as Sarah sat by the window in her living room, watching the city lights twinkle outside, she felt a profound sense of relief. Her investigation had led to answers, and while the outcome had not confirmed her fears, it had reinforced her role as Emily's protector. She sipped her tea, thinking back over the past weeks. When she had first noticed the locked door and Pastor Mark's insistence on privacy, her instincts had sounded an alarm. It was a mother's job to ask questions, to follow her gut when something didn't sit right. But today had shown her the other side of that coin, the importance of seeking truth without succumbing to fear or judgment. Emily bounded into the room, holding up her small prize from the treasure chest, a colorful keychain shaped like a star. "Look, Mom, isn't it cool?" "It's beautiful," Sarah said, pulling her daughter onto her lap. "Did you have fun today?" "Yes. Pastor Mark said I did the best acting as the Samaritan. He said I was really kind," Emily said, her eyes shining. Sarah smiled and kissed Emily's forehead. "You were kind, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Emily grinned, then scampered off to her room, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts again. She thought back to her conversation with Angela and the supportive words from Rachel and Lisa. They had helped her realize that her concerns were valid, but also that the community she was part of wasn't her enemy. Trust wasn't about blind faith. It was about transparency and understanding. The following Sunday, Sarah approached Pastor Mark after the service. This time, her demeanor was relaxed, her gratitude genuine. "Pastor Mark," she said, "I just wanted to thank you again for letting me sit in on the session last week. It meant a lot to me." "Of course, Sarah," he replied with a warm smile. "I hope it gave you some peace of mind." "It did," she admitted. "And I also realized something important. Sometimes, our fears come from not knowing. I appreciate the openness you showed. It made all the difference." Pastor Mark nodded. "I think it's natural to want to protect the ones we love. You're a great mom, Sarah. Emily's lucky to have you." "Thank you," Sarah said, her heart full. "And I'm glad she has this community to grow in." As the weeks went by, Sarah noticed a subtle change in herself. She still trusted her instincts, but she also embraced a more measured approach when addressing her concerns. She learned to ask questions without jumping to conclusions, to seek answers with curiosity rather than fear. It was a balance she knew would serve her well as a mother and as a member of the church. Her bond with Emily deepened, too. Through their conversations about trust, safety, and openness, Sarah felt more connected to her daughter than ever before. Emily, in turn, seemed to understand the depth of her mother's love and the strength behind her quiet resolve. Sitting in the pew one Sunday, Sarah looked around at the familiar faces of her church community. The choir began to sing, and the sanctuary filled with the uplifting sound of voices united in harmony. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt at peace. She realized that her journey hadn't been just about uncovering the truth about Pastor Mark or the locked room. It had been about rediscovering her own strength and the importance of balancing intuition with understanding. In the end, it wasn't about proving herself right or wrong. It was about ensuring that she and Emily were safe, loved, and part of a trusting community. As the final hymn concluded and Emily reached for her hand, Sarah squeezed it gently, her heart full of gratitude. Together, they stepped out into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and check out this next story. It's incredibly moving.